The road leading to the abandoned resort is cracked like old bone, swallowed by weeds, and silent in a way that feels deliberate, almost protective. For years, locals have whispered about this place, a once luxurious escape now reduced to a hollowed-out skeleton of rotting timber and peeling paint. Yet nothing about its decay feels natural. It feels paused. As if the resort is holding its breath, waiting for someone to disturb it again. When the documentary crew first approaches, the air changes. The wind doesn't rustle, it sighs. Even the birds seem to avoid the sprawling property, circling high overhead but never daring to land. At a distance, the resort still carries the shape of opulence, arched windows, a grand terrace, a sprawling pool drained long ago. But up close, every surface tells the same story: abandonment, neglect, and time wearing thin on a place that once pulsed with life. The front lobby doors hang crookedly, one hinge broken. Inside, dust coats every surface like a burial shroud. The reception desk still holds a cracked telephone, its cord curled like a petrified serpent. A thin layer of grime covers an old bell that once called staff to eager guests. Now, when tapped, it doesn't ring. It thuds, heavy and hollow. Strangely, despite years of abandonment, many things look untouched. Faded brochures still rest neatly in their display rack. A row of suitcases sits lined against a wall, as if waiting for guests who stepped away momentarily. And on the far side of the lobby, beneath a shattered chandelier, lies the item that has puzzled investigators for over a decade: the guest logbook. At first glance, it is just a dusty relic. Bound in cracked leather, corners bent, pages yellowed. But when authorities first stumbled across it, something stood out immediately: entries made in handwriting that was surprisingly clean. Ink that hadn't faded. Dates that didn't make sense. Because the resort had officially shut down in 1998. Yet the signatures continued well into the 2000s. Some chalked it up to vandals sneaking in to leave their marks. Teenagers looking for a thrill. Urban explorers who wanted to add a mysterious detail to the legend of the place. The problem was, the names weren't random. The first signature that raised alarms belonged to Daniel Mercer, a guest who had stayed at the resort twice in the 1990s. His final recorded visit in the logbook was dated August 12, 2004, 6 years after the resort had closed its doors forever. The ink on the page was crisp, fresh-looking, as though written within the past week. The handwriting was an exact match to samples taken from his old registration cards. But Daniel Mercer had been declared missing in the summer of 2002. His family insisted he would never have returned here. Investigators tried to trace the signature back to forgers or vandals, but no evidence ever surfaced. No footprints, no fingerprints, no signs of recent trespassing when the entry was made. And though many chalked it up to coincidence, Daniel's case file noted something else: almost no one knew he had ever stayed at this resort. His visits were private, undocumented by friends or relatives. So how would a random trespasser know to sign his name? The discovery triggered mild interest at first, but then more signatures were found. Some were illegible scrawls, likely belonging to drifters. But a handful were unmistakably tied to real individuals, 4 of whom were confirmed missing at the time their names appeared on those pages. The resort itself, strangely enough, showed no signs of recent habitation. Dust was undisturbed, rooms remained untouched, and the surrounding grounds lacked any trails or footprints that would normally be left by visitors. It was as if the signatures materialized on the pages without anyone ever stepping foot inside. When news of this anomaly spread, investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths flocked to the resort. Yet despite cameras, forensic tools, and countless hours of surveillance, nothing unusual was ever recorded. No intruders, no animals, no movement at all. Still, the unanswered question lingered in every shadowed hallway: if no one entered the resort, who wrote in the book? And as investigators peeled back the crumbling layers of the building, they discovered something stranger. On the same page where one missing person had signed their name, someone else had added a short note: uneven handwriting, the letters trembling as though written in haste. 3 words. "You're too late." The message chilled even the veteran officers present during the initial discovery. It implied urgency, awareness, and the presence of someone, perhaps someone who didn't want to be found. Or someone who had never left. As the team turned the brittle pages, a darker realization crept in: the signatures weren't just entries. They were timestamps. Footprints in ink. Silent markers of people who had vanished without explanation. Yet one signature remained unmatched. The one that would eventually force authorities to reopen old case files. The one written in the same sweeping cursive used by a man who had disappeared long before the resort ever closed. The founder. And his signature was dated 10 years after he was last seen alive. When the resort first opened its doors in the late 1970s, it was more than just a vacation destination, it was a promise. A shining monument to ambition perched on a quiet stretch of countryside that, at the time, had nothing but farmland and forest for miles. Locals remembered the day the grand ribbon-cutting ceremony took place, the air buzzing with excitement as reporters, investors, and families poured in to witness what newspapers called a new era of luxury. That dream belonged to one man, Jonathan Hale, a real estate developer whose charisma was almost hypnotic. He was the kind of figure who walked into a room and instantly drew every eye, not because of wealth, though he had plenty, but because he radiated unwavering confidence. People trusted him. Investors believed him. Employees admired him. Even those who disliked him couldn't ignore the gravitational pull he created wherever he went. Jonathan spoke of the resort as though it were a living being, a sanctuary built from hope, he would often say during interviews. But behind that poetic charm were shadows few people ever saw. He had grown up in a broken household, shuffled between relatives, surviving on the belief that if he ever built something beautiful, something permanent, he could finally outrun the instability that haunted his childhood. That desperation became the fuel behind his empire. Construction began with unprecedented speed. Jonathan spared no expense in importing marble tiles from Italy, handcrafted chandeliers from Prague, and oak beams from forests that had stood untouched for centuries. Every detail mattered. Every corner had to reflect grandeur. And for a while, it worked. Early guests described the resort as otherworldly, a place where worries dissolved at the gates. But beneath the shimmering surface, small fractures were already forming. Some workers claimed the land felt wrong, especially after sunset. Machines malfunctioned inexplicably. Tools went missing and reappeared in places no one remembered leaving them. One night, a cement mixer switched on by itself, nearly injuring 3 men. Jonathan dismissed it all as superstition. A new project always stirs nerves, he assured everyone. But privately, he began pacing the halls late at night, as if expecting to find someone hiding in the unfinished rooms. Even in its earliest days, the resort seemed to hold secrets. And Jonathan, whether knowingly or not, became part of them. Employees later spoke about how he would disappear for hours at a time during construction, supposedly to check on progress in the lower levels. But those basement corridors weren't officially included in the blueprints until much later. When pressed, Jonathan insisted the spaces were simply for storage. Yet workers remembered hearing the metallic clang of doors closing deep underground when no one was scheduled to be there. Once the resort opened, those whispers faded into background noise. The first year was a triumph. Celebrities vacationed there. Honeymooners reserved rooms months in advance. Revenues soared. Jonathan's dream had materialized into something real, something grand enough to silence the ghosts of his past. But success came with cracks too small for most guests to notice. Housekeepers complained of rooms left in disarray even though no one had checked in. Security guards reported unexplained alarms tripping in locked hallways. One receptionist even swore she saw a man walk into the lobby wearing outdated clothing from decades prior, only for him to vanish before reaching the elevator. Jonathan brushed it all aside. Stories keep the place interesting, he'd joke, though his smile rarely reached his eyes anymore. He began spending more time alone, studying documents late into the night, poring over renovation plans with growing frustration. Some believed the financial strain was getting to him. Others suspected he was concealing something. There was one person who seemed genuinely worried, Amelia Carter, the resort's head of guest services. She had worked closely with Jonathan since the early planning stages and knew his behavior better than anyone. She noticed him becoming increasingly secretive, locking his office door, storing files in drawers he never used before, and making late-night phone calls in hushed tones. When she confronted him gently, Jonathan's expression remained calm, but his voice held tension she had never heard before. "Some things are best handled quietly," he said. "For everyone's sake." The phrase unsettled Amelia more than she cared to admit. By the mid-1980s, the resort was struggling behind the scenes. Financial mismanagement rumors circulated among employees, though none could confirm it. Some claimed Jonathan was siphoning money into a project he refused to discuss. Others speculated he was being threatened by investors. And through all of this, the land itself seemed to resist. Strange weather patterns, power outages, unexplained structural issues, as if the resort was fighting against something buried beneath its foundations. Jonathan became increasingly paranoid. He was seen muttering to himself, standing alone on the balcony overlooking the property, his eyes scanning the darkness as though expecting someone, or something, to emerge. Then one night, without warning, Jonathan Hale disappeared. He didn't resign. He didn't leave a note. He didn't inform staff or family. His car remained parked near the service entrance. His office was untouched except for one detail, a single page torn from the guest logbook, left face up on his desk. It had no name. No date. Just a long, heavy slash of ink across the center, as if someone had tried to write something but changed their mind at the last second. Jonathan's disappearance marked the first true fracture in the resort's timeline. The empire he built from desperation began to unravel in ways no one could stop. And though the resort continued operating for years after his vanishing, something was different. Something had shifted. Whatever darkness Jonathan tried to outrun had quietly stepped back into the halls he once called his masterpiece. The years following Jonathan Hale's disappearance were marked by a strange duality. On the surface, the resort continued operating as if nothing had happened, welcoming new guests, hosting weddings, and maintaining its glittering reputation. But beneath that glossy exterior, an unease had settled, a quiet tension that most guests couldn't quite articulate, but almost everyone felt. Something in the hallways seemed to listen. Something in the rooms seemed to linger. It began subtly, with isolated complaints. A couple staying in room 214 reported hearing footsteps pacing above them long after midnight, even though the room above was unoccupied. A family claimed their lights flickered constantly, but when maintenance checked the wiring, everything appeared perfect. A lone traveler insisted someone knocked on his door 3 separate times, yet every time he checked, no one was there. These incidents were brushed aside as quirks of an aging building. But then more unsettling stories surfaced, ones that couldn't be easily dismissed. One of the earliest disturbing cases involved Laura Bennett, a young college student who checked into the resort for a weekend getaway. She was described as bright, friendly, and responsible, someone who always kept in touch with her family. She checked in on a Friday afternoon, smiling in her registration photo, room key in hand. By Sunday morning, she had vanished. Her belongings were found neatly arranged in her suite. Clothes folded. Phone charging. A nearly finished journal entry open on the desk, the pen still uncapped beside it. But the entry ended mid-sentence, as if she had been interrupted by someone she trusted, or startled by something she didn't understand. The resort security footage offered little help. Laura was seen entering her room on Saturday evening but was never recorded leaving it. No forced entry. No signs of struggle. It was as though she had simply stepped out of existence. Her disappearance remained unsolved. Then there was Michael Caldwell, a retired veteran who visited the resort annually as a personal tradition. He always requested the same room, spent his days reading by the pool, and tipped generously. Staff considered him one of the most predictable guests, until the year he arrived and started reporting things no one knew how to answer. He told housekeepers that someone had been entering his room while he slept. Not stealing. Not harming him. Just staring. He claimed he'd wake up in the middle of the night to the distinct feeling of being watched, the air heavy with someone else's breath. Once, he swore he saw the silhouette of a man leaning against the wall near his bed. But when he blinked, the shadow dissolved into the darkness. Michael tried to laugh it off, blaming old age and fading eyesight. But on the third night, he stormed to the front desk demanding to switch rooms. His face was pale, his hands trembling. He didn't explain why. He didn't have to, his fear said enough. He stayed one more night in his new room. By morning, he was gone. Like Laura, his personal belongings remained behind. His suitcase, wallet, and medications were untouched. Staff assumed he had left early, but when no one heard from him for days, his family filed a missing person report. Police searched the resort from top to bottom. Nothing. No footprints. No broken locks. No trail to follow. 2 guests missing in similar fashion might have been coincidence. But a pattern like this, clean rooms, abandoned belongings, final sightings caught on internal cameras but never leaving the premises, suggested something far more deliberate. As investigators revisited the resort's archives years later, they noticed something chilling. Both Laura and Michael had stayed in rooms located within the same wing, the oldest, least renovated part of the resort. A wing Jonathan Hale reportedly spent most of his time inspecting during construction. Employees remembered rumors about that wing. Housekeepers claimed certain rooms felt colder, even in summer. Maintenance workers said the electrical circuits failed there more often than anywhere else. A few staff members even avoided that corridor entirely, insisting they felt an unseen presence trailing them whenever they passed through. Still, these stories never reached the public. The resort maintained its image, burying unsettling reports under customer service smiles and carefully crafted statements. But one night, something happened that couldn't be buried. A front desk employee noticed unusual activity on the access logs, electronic records that monitored which staff keycards opened restricted doors. At exactly 3:17 a.m., a maintenance door located deep within the older wing registered activity. Someone had opened it using a staff keycard. The problem was, no staff member was scheduled to be in that area at the time. Security footage from that hallway showed nothing. The cameras flickered for 3 seconds and then returned to normal. Yet the lock clearly recorded an entry. When the morning shift inspected the area, they found dust disturbed in a narrow path leading toward a utility stairwell. As if someone, or something, had walked through the corridor without triggering motion sensors. The deeper investigators dug, the more they realized these incidents shared a similar trait: they left no witness, no struggle, no clear motive. Just a lingering sense that there were corners of the resort where the walls themselves were holding secrets. And then there were the guest logs. Every person who vanished had their name neatly signed in the book upon check-in. But in each case, a hotel staff member later discovered something eerie: the signatures had been traced over. The original ink overwriting older marks. As though someone had carefully, deliberately rewritten their names, days after they disappeared. And it wasn't just the missing guests. Some signatures in the old log seemed to belong to individuals who never stayed at the resort at all, names with no reservations, no payment records, no check-ins. But the handwriting looked familiar. Too familiar. A handwriting expert would later describe it as eerily consistent, matching strokes found in multiple unrelated entries. As though the same unseen hand had been quietly writing in the book, for years. By the early 1990s, the resort was still operational on paper, still accepting guests, still promoting its picturesque lake views and serene hiking trails, but behind the scenes, the cracks had widened into dangerous fissures. Employees whispered among themselves, their voices low, their glances nervous. Something was wrong in the building, something no one dared acknowledge openly. And yet, everyone felt it. The first major sign of collapse came from within the staff. Housekeepers, once cheerful and chatty, began requesting transfers away from the oldest wing. Maintenance workers refused to perform night shift duties. Even senior managers, people loyal to the resort for years, started handing in abrupt resignations, citing vague reasons like personal issues or unforeseen circumstances. But those who remained noticed a pattern. Every staff member who quit had worked at least once in the restricted lower levels or the Old West Wing. Guests sensed the shift too. Reviews from that era were polite but strained, hinting at discomfort without saying it outright. Words like unsettling, strange atmosphere, and odd noises at night appeared in more than a few comment cards. Yet the management continued brushing off every complaint, insisting the resort was fully functional and safe. But the facade was weakening. Tension reached its breaking point in the winter of 1996, when a massive staff walkout paralyzed the resort overnight. It wasn't organized. It wasn't planned. It simply happened. One employee left, then another, then 6 more by sunrise. Many refused to collect their final paychecks. They simply disappeared from the roster, never explaining their decision publicly. One of the departing housekeepers confided to a friend that she'd found something inside a room, something she refused to describe, after which she said she couldn't sleep for days. She was gone by the end of the week. Despite all this, the resort limped forward. Marketing campaigns became more aggressive, offering steep discounts to lure visitors. But then came the failures, electrical outages lasting hours, water pressure dropping to zero without warning, fire alarms shrieking randomly in the middle of calm afternoons. The maintenance logs from that year read like a descent into chaos: broken elevators, malfunctioning ventilation systems, reports of strange, metallic odors in hallways. Still, none of these issues officially justified shutting the resort down. Then, in the spring of 1998, things took a sharp turn. A series of internal memos, later leaked to investigators, indicated that senior management had been instructed to stop filing certain incident reports. Instead, they were told to forward unusual events to executive storage without documentation. What executive storage referred to remains unclear. The phrase never appeared in any official handbook or corporate guideline. Some staff members believed it meant Jonathan Hale's office. Though he had been missing for nearly a decade, the room remained untouched, locked, and sealed under obscure legal protections. Around the same time, a private inspection team, brought in quietly, without announcing their presence, spent 2 days surveying the basement and utility zones. Their report had only one page accessible to authorities after the shutdown. It read, "Area unsafe for occupation. Immediate remediation required. Full closure recommended." No explanation. No description of what they found. No follow-up. The resort officially attributed its shutdown to unforeseen financial strain, but employees who worked there during the final months told a different story. They recalled an atmosphere that felt pressing, like a storm building behind every wall. People reported hearing footsteps in closed-off corridors, low whispers near ventilation grates, and doors opening on their own. One night, the front lobby chandelier swayed violently even though the building was fully sealed and weather reports recorded 0 wind. The last straw came during a late summer event in August 1998, a company retreat attended by 30 guests. On the second night, a massive blackout struck the resort. Everything went dark, every room, every hallway, every exterior light. The emergency generators failed instantly, something engineers later said should have been impossible. In the pitch-black chaos, guests panicked. Staff scrambled for flashlights. Several individuals claimed they saw figures moving in the darkness, figures that didn't speak, didn't react, didn't seem entirely human in the disorienting shadows. When power finally returned an hour later, nothing appeared disturbed. Except for one thing. The door to the old maintenance wing, locked, welded, and sealed shut since 1985, was standing wide open. Security immediately swept the area, but they found nothing. No footprints. No broken seal. No signs of forced entry. They simply couldn't explain how the door had opened. Within 48 hours, a corporate notice arrived ordering the resort to close indefinitely. Guests were refunded. Staff were dismissed. The building was shuttered with alarming speed, as if the decision had been made long before the blackout ever occurred. Rumors spread quickly. Some said management feared lawsuits. Others believed a hidden structural issue threatened the safety of the property. But off the record, several employees claimed a different reason altogether. Someone high in the corporation had issued a forced evacuation order, citing undisclosed threats to physical and psychological well-being. That document, too, would be leaked years later. The resort, once a beacon of luxury and escape, fell silent overnight. Nature slowly wrapped itself around the abandoned building, vines creeping over balconies, rust eating at pipes, dust swallowing hallways. Yet even after it shut down, patrol officers occasionally reported lights turning on inside the resort, despite power being disconnected. Others claimed they saw figures in the windows, watching them pass. A few even received calls from disconnected internal lines when passing through the property at night. Still, no one dared enter. Not until the urban explorer arrived years later, stepping through the empty lobby, unaware that the resort's secrets had been waiting patiently for his return. But the resort had left one last unanswered question, hidden in documents never meant to surface. The shutdown wasn't triggered by finances. It was triggered by something, or someone, still inside. For nearly a decade after the shutdown, the resort remained untouched, a hollow monument surrounded by rustling trees and fading memories. Locals avoided it, teenagers dared each other to approach its gates, and occasional trespassers left nothing behind but boot prints in the dirt. But no one ventured deep inside. No one stayed long enough to uncover anything real. Not until Ethan Ward arrived. Ethan wasn't the typical thrill-seeking explorer who hunted abandoned places just for adrenaline. He was a documentarian in his own right, though unofficial, armed with a battered camera, a flashlight, and an old YouTube channel dedicated to exploring forgotten structures. His approach was different. He looked for stories, for the human traces left behind. He searched for meaning in ruins. And when a subscriber sent him a vague message about a resort frozen in time, Ethan felt a pull he couldn't explain. He arrived late in the afternoon, hoping to catch the golden light slipping through broken windows. As he approached the resort, he found the air unnervingly still, the trees crowding the entrance like sentinels. He expected graffiti, vandalism, debris scattered by squatters. Instead, the building stood strangely preserved, as if abandonment had never fully claimed it. Inside, the silence pressed against him like weight. Footsteps echoed too long, too sharply, as though something else moved beneath the sound. Dust layered the floor thickly, yet some areas seemed recently disturbed. Ethan documented everything: rooms, hallways, abandoned luggage still sitting beside the front desk, the pristine brochures untouched by time. The unsettling orderliness made him uneasy, but nothing could prepare him for what he found at the center of the lobby. The guest logbook lay open on the reception counter. Not buried beneath debris. Not inside a drawer. Open. Waiting. Ethan moved closer, filming his trembling hand hovering above the pages. The leather cover was cracked and warm to the touch, as though it had been handled recently. That alone was impossible, no one had lived here in years. He flipped the first few pages, skimming guest names from the 1980s and 90s, entries that aligned with the resort's operating years. Then he reached the signatures that shouldn't have been there. Dates from 2001. 2003, 2007. Names circled in red ink at the edges, though he couldn't tell who had marked them or why. He felt the temperature drop, a cold draft sweeping through the lobby even though every window was tightly shut. Still filming, Ethan whispered to himself, "There's no way these are real." His voice trembled through the microphone. He leaned in closer, tracing the carefully written loops of letters. These signatures didn't look like vandalism. They weren't rushed or messy. They looked intentional, calm, steady, as if written by someone who believed they had every right to be there. Then he noticed something that sent a chill up his spine. One signature stood out, not because of its handwriting, but because of the name. Daniel Mercer. The missing man whose family never received closure. Ethan froze. He had read about Mercer in a forum thread once, an unsolved disappearance with theories ranging from foul play to voluntary escape. But why would his name be here? The date next to his signature was 6 years after the resort closed. Ethan took a step back. Dust shifted under his boot, but another sound followed, soft, like something scraping across the floor behind him. He spun around. Nothing. Just the empty lobby stretching into darkness. Swallowing hard, Ethan returned to the book and flipped to the more recent pages. And that's when he saw it. A message, written in uneven strokes, carving through the page as if the writer's hand had trembled violently, "Still here." Ethan's breath caught. His heart hammered. The camera shook in his hands. He wasn't sure if it was a prank, a message left by some other explorer, or something more sinister. But the handwriting didn't match any of the previous entries. It was jagged, frantic, almost desperate. He moved deeper into the building, driven by dread and curiosity. He explored the west wing, pushing through warped doors and flickering flashlight beams. Every room felt abandoned yet occupied at the same time. Beds still made. Curtains swaying slightly even with no wind. Once, he thought he caught the faint scent of someone's perfume, fresh, not decades old. He recorded his observations, but as he went further in, he noticed something disturbing. Some rooms looked lived in. Blankets were pulled back as if someone had just risen. Soap lay wet in a bathroom sink. A half-burned candle rested on a nightstand. His flashlight flickered. He smacked it lightly. It steadied, then dimmed again. Ethan paused outside room 327, hesitating before entering. Something about it felt wrong. Not just eerie, wrong. Inside, the air was thick, almost metallic. The room was immaculate except for one detail: the guest logbook sat on the desk again. But Ethan had left the original one in the lobby. This one was smaller, battered, and filled with pages torn out. He approached slowly, dread crawling up his spine. On the first page, written in the same frantic script he saw earlier, were 3 words: "Don't follow them." His hands trembled. Them? Who was them? Explorers? Criminals? Staff who never left? He scanned the room, pulse racing, certain someone was watching him from the corner. But when he shined his light, nothing was there. Nothing visible. He grabbed his camera and backed away, filming the room one last time. As he stepped into the hallway, he felt it, the pressure of eyes on him, heavy and unblinking. That was when he made his biggest mistake. He kept going deeper instead of turning back. And somewhere in the silent corridors ahead, a sound echoed faintly. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Matching his pace as though someone, or something, was walking just out of sight. Ethan would later tell investigators he had no memory of leaving the resort. His footage simply cuts out. The next clip shows him running through the forest, gasping for breath, camera shaking violently. But when he reviewed the recordings months later, he discovered something he had missed during the panic. One last shot of the lobby, and the guest logbook closing on its own. When investigators finally gained access to Ethan's footage, after months of hesitation on his part and pressure from officials, it wasn't the shaky visuals or eerie sounds that caught their attention first. It was the guest logbook. The same book found years prior by police, the same one containing names of missing individuals, now recorded again on Ethan's camera in disturbing clarity. For the first time in years, authorities had fresh evidence that something inside the resort had never stopped moving. The forensic team brought the logbook into a controlled lab environment. They opened it carefully, page by fragile page. The ink shimmered under ultraviolet analysis, revealing a glaring impossibility. Many entries were written with inks manufactured long after the resort closed. One entry used a formulation released 5 years after the last employee walked out the doors. Another signature was in gel ink that didn't exist in the 1990s. It meant someone had handled the book recently, very recently. But that wasn't the most unsettling discovery. The handwriting samples, once dismissed as coincidence, now displayed disturbing consistency. Investigators compared entries from different years, different supposed authors, and different dates. Subtle patterns emerged: identical angles in certain letters, repeated pen pressure habits, unique stylistic flourishes that no two unrelated people should share. A forensic handwriting expert, after hours of analysis, concluded, there is a high probability that multiple signatures were created by the same individual intentionally mimicking others. That raised a far darker question: who was forging signatures of missing guests inside a sealed resort? Or worse, who was rewriting the names of people who vanished there? The deeper they examined, the stranger it became. 4 signatures stood out in particular, each belonging to a person reported missing near the resort over a span of 2 decades. Each missing person had signed the logbook after their disappearance. Not before, after. Take the case of Laura Bennett, the college student from Section 3. Her signature appeared 3 days after she vanished, written in her delicate cursive. Experts verified it matched her handwriting exactly, down to the looping curl on the letter B. Yet ink analysis confirmed the signature was only a few years old, created with a pen type she never owned. Even more perplexing was the signature of Michael Caldwell, the veteran who vanished 1 year before the resort closed. His name appeared twice in the logbook, once on the day he checked in, and again 12 years after his disappearance. The strokes were identical, as if traced by someone who knew his writing intimately. But the second entry showed something subtle: tremors. Small, almost undetectable vibrations in the letters, the kind that come from a shaking hand. Experts initially assumed it was stress. Others suspected something else: age. But Michael would have been long dead by the time the tremors appeared. It made no sense. Investigators expanded their scope, pulling old missing persons files dating back to the resort's earliest years. Among them was the most shocking match of all: the signature of Jonathan Hale, the founder who vanished nearly a decade before the resort closed. His name appeared on the final page of the book, written in sweeping, confident strokes identical to samples from his old documents. But the date beside his name was impossible. It was written 10 years after he disappeared. Investigators stared at it for hours, rechecking every forensic test, every timestamp, every chemical reading. Nothing contradicted the result. The ink was fresh. The pressure patterns were modern. The signature was authentic. If Jonathan Hale didn't write it, someone wanted them to believe he did. And yet, there were no signs of tampering at the resort's entrance. Dust patterns showed no recent intrusions. The metal locks on the doors had rusted into place, requiring tools to break open. Windows were still coated with grime thick enough to mark any disturbance. The only anomaly was in the underground levels, maintenance tunnels with air circulation that suggested someone had been down there far more recently than anyone admitted. Authorities now believed the logbook wasn't just a register. It was a timeline. A silent ledger of people who entered the resort and never left. But there was another layer still hidden. A criminologist noticed an oddity when mapping where each forged signature appeared in the book. The entries weren't random, they followed a pattern. Every missing person's signature appeared on pages corresponding to the rooms they last stayed in. Page 214 matched room 214. Page 327 matched room 327. It was as if someone was documenting victims using the structure of the resort itself. Then came the detail no one expected. On several entries, faint under-pressure marks showed that the writer had pressed the pen too hard, leaving impressions on the pages beneath. When investigators ran these impressions through a digital enhancement tool, ghost-like outlines appeared. Hidden beneath the signatures were phrases: "Stay quiet, they watch the halls, cannot leave, help us." Each phrase grew more frantic, more disjointed, until the final decipherable imprint: "He is still here." That single pronoun, he, sent a ripple of unease through the investigation team. Did it refer to a killer? A squatter? Jonathan Hale himself? Or someone else never identified? The investigation took a darker turn when authorities revisited the resort. This time, they brought structural engineers and infrared equipment. As they combed through the oldest corridors, they detected abnormal heat patterns behind several walls, odd, considering there was no electrical grid connected. Behind one panel, they found scratch marks etched deep into the drywall. Not graffiti, scrapes from fingernails or tools, layered over years. On another wall, in the faintest traces of what looked like charcoal, someone had written, "They come at night." But the discovery that rattled everyone came in the lower tunnels, places sealed since the 1980s. In one corner, covered in dust and debris, sat a small wooden crate containing dozens of loose pages. They were torn from various logbooks, some dating back to the resort's earliest years. Each page bore a signature, some recognizable, some belonging to people who were never recorded as guests at all. And on nearly every page, the same handwriting appeared in the margins. Chaotic. Jagged. Fearful. "Don't trust the doors," he keeps calling them back. "We didn't leave, the rooms are wrong inside." He waits. The implications were staggering. Whoever had written these messages wasn't signing the logbook, they were warning outsiders. Or documenting something only they could see. The combination of forged signatures, authentic handwriting from missing individuals, and margins filled with frantic messages painted a haunting possibility: the resort hadn't merely hosted disappearances. It had kept a record of them. And at the center of that record, one name appeared more consistently than any other. Jonathan Hale. His handwriting. His signature. His unseen presence woven through every era of the resort. As if even after vanishing, he had never really left. For investigators, one chilling question now overshadowed the rest: were the signatures written by the missing people, or written for them by someone who wanted to keep them alive on paper long after they were gone? When the signatures were confirmed authentic, and impossibly recent, the case shifted from a curiosity to a full-scale investigation. Files that had been cold for decades were reopened. Boxes sealed with fading evidence tape were hauled out of archives. Detectives who had once worked the original missing person cases were contacted, many now retired, some unwilling to revisit what they hadn't been able to solve the first time. But the evidence was undeniable. Something at the resort had been active long after its closure, something that touched every disappearance in ways no one had ever connected before. To lead the renewed effort, authorities assigned Detective Mara Ellison, a seasoned investigator known for her relentless pursuit of truth. Mara was calm, introspective, and methodical, everything this labyrinthine case needed. She arrived at the abandoned resort with a small team, her boots crunching through gravel and weeds as she surveyed the massive structure looming ahead like a sleeping beast. Her breath clouded in the air, though it was far from cold enough for that. She noted the temperature drop but said nothing aloud. Mara had studied every detail of the old reports. She knew about Jonathan Hale's disappearance. She knew about Laura Bennett, Michael Caldwell, and the others who had walked through these doors and never returned. She had read Ethan Ward's frightened commentary in the footage, heard the tremor in his voice as he whispered about seeing shadows that didn't follow normal movement. She had watched the logbook close by itself. Forensic analysts insisted wind or vibration could explain it, but Mara had seen enough in her career to trust her instincts when something felt deeply wrong. The team began by examining the restricted areas, the Old West Wing, the sealed maintenance tunnels, and the underground corridors. Engineers cut through the rusted metal barriers, revealing passageways untouched for decades. Dust should have been thick, but to everyone's confusion, certain sections looked as though they had been disturbed recently, paths cleared through dirt, faint drag marks, and impressions that didn't match typical footprints. Something had moved through these tight hallways. Something that didn't want to be found. Mara made her way to the lowest level, a narrow corridor lined with pipes that groaned under shifting pressure. She ran her hand lightly along the wall, feeling faint indentations beneath the grime. Someone had scratched lines into the plaster, not words, just marks. Deep, uneven, frantic. She leaned closer. Some were old. Others were fresh, the plaster chipped in sharp, pale fragments still lying at the baseboards. As the team proceeded deeper, their flashlights flickered. Static filled the radios. Mara kept calm, instructing everyone to stay within sight lines, but the discomfort settled over her team like a veil. They were professionals, trained for crime scenes far more dangerous than abandoned property. Yet several admitted later that they felt watched every moment they were underground. On one wall, they found something that froze everyone in place. A single word written in black, smeared ink, found. The handwriting matched the frantic script seen in the margins of the torn logbook pages. Mara photographed it, silent for a long moment. Someone had been here, recently. Someone desperate enough to leave warnings, yet alive enough to still be moving within these walls. Upstairs, another team combed through administrative offices. Most were ransacked by time, but Jonathan Hale's office remained eerily untouched. It had been sealed by court order after his disappearance, preserved as part of an unresolved missing person case. Dust clung to the furniture, yet the air inside felt disturbed, as though someone had walked through moments earlier. Mara examined Jonathan's desk. It was pristine except for a locked drawer that previous investigators had struggled to open. This time, with more advanced tools, they cracked it within minutes. Inside lay a stack of personal notes, journal fragments, sketches, unsettling symbols drawn over floor plans of the resort. Many pages contained repeated phrases: "It isn't finished, I hear them in the walls, the rooms shift when I'm alone, keep them inside, she watches from the mirrors." The deeper Mara read, the more disturbed she became. Jonathan's tone oscillated between fear and determination, as if he believed he was protecting the resort from something unseen, or protecting people from something deeper within the resort. Then came a note written shakily, barely legible: "If they leave, it follows." Back underground, a forensics agent called Mara urgently. The team had reached a small, sealed chamber, a space not listed on any blueprint, official or leaked. The door was not just locked, it had been welded shut from the outside. It was as though someone wanted to ensure whatever was inside never got out. They cut through the welding marks, sparks raining onto the dusty floor. When the metal gave way, a gust of air burst outward, stale, cold, carrying a scent that made several members recoil. The chamber was small, claustrophobic, lit only by the team's flashlights reflecting off its damp walls. Inside were signs of occupation. Old food containers. Blankets neatly folded. Dozens of pages scattered across the floor, more torn fragments of guest logs. Some pages were crumpled. Others were laid out carefully. All bore signatures, some matching missing persons, some names no one had ever been able to trace, and some written in Jonathan Hale's unmistakable handwriting. The most disturbing discovery sat against the far wall, a cluster of fingerprints preserved in the dust. Lab analysis later confirmed something impossible: the fingerprints belonged to Jonathan Hale. The aging pattern suggested he had touched the walls not decades ago, but within the last few years. Mara felt the air thicken around her. The walls felt closer somehow. "How could he be alive?" a technician whispered. Mara didn't answer. She wasn't sure the question was, is he alive? It might have been something far worse: was he ever truly gone? Another officer called her attention to a narrow passageway behind the chamber. It was partly hidden, jagged at the edges as if hammered open from the inside. The small tunnel led to an unmarked maintenance hallway that none of them recognized from the blueprints. The structure was old, much older than the rest of the resort, and the architecture didn't match any documented renovation phase. Someone had created this passage deliberately. Someone who had needed a way to move unseen. As they followed the corridor, their flashlights caught faint smears of ink on the wall. Words. Repeated over and over, trailing down the passage like a desperate chant, "He's coming, he's coming, he's coming," but the phrase stopped abruptly at the end of the hall, where a second welded door blocked their path, this one reinforced far more heavily. A dread settled over Mara. She felt as though the door was holding back more than air and darkness. As her team prepared to cut through the metal, she glanced at the floor. Dust had been disturbed. Fresh marks indicated something, or someone, had been standing directly in front of that door not long ago. Watching. Waiting. But for what? When the team finally began slicing through the welds, Mara couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to unleash something the resort had spent decades trying to contain. The moment the cutting torch touched the reinforced door, the air in the corridor grew heavier, thick enough that several team members later described feeling as though they were standing underwater. Mara sensed it too, a tension that didn't belong in an abandoned building. Something about this door felt different from the first one they had opened. This wasn't meant to keep intruders out. It was meant to keep something inside. Metal shrieked as the welds cracked, sparks cascading to the floor like falling stars. Each inch the door loosened made the temperature drop further. When the final hinge gave way, the heavy slab of metal fell inward with a dull, earth-shaking thud. A stale blast of air rushed out, cold enough to make their breath mist. The flashlight struggled to cut through the darkness inside, as though the blackness had mass. As the beams finally pierced the void, the team fell silent. The room was larger than expected, far larger. Concrete walls extended farther than the blueprints suggested, disappearing into shadows. It wasn't a utility room. It wasn't storage. It was some kind of hidden chamber. And someone had lived here. Mara's light fell upon a makeshift bed fashioned from old blankets piled atop wooden pallets. Nearby sat a collection of metal cans, some decades old, others disturbingly recent. A dented kettle. Piles of crumpled paper. Faded photographs pinned to the wall with nails. Some showed the resort in its early days. Others depicted faces, guests, employees, even staff ID photos, arranged in no discernible pattern. But the detail that sent a chill deeper than any draft was the writing. Everywhere, on every wall, someone had written messages. Overlapping. Layered. Some in black ink, some smeared charcoal, others etched directly into the concrete with fingernails or metal scraps. Words repeated obsessively, "Not alone, walls listen, don't sleep, they move when lights die," some phrases crossed over older ones, violently scribbled out. Others were clean and intentional, like instructions. And then, there were log pages. Hundreds of them. Some carefully arranged in stacks. Others scattered on the floor. Many were torn from the guest logbook, but others came from different logbooks, smaller, older, handwritten in formats not used since the early 1980s. Pages from decades apart lay mixed together as though time inside this room had blurred into something meaningless. Mara crouched to examine one. The name on the page belonged to a woman who disappeared in 1983. A second page bore the name of a man missing since 1995. Another page listed multiple signatures, some overlapping, some written over one another so aggressively the paper had nearly torn through. "What is this?" one officer whispered. Mara lifted a trembling page. The signature belonged to Jonathan Hale. He had signed multiple pages. Different years. Different pens. Different levels of shakiness. It made no sense, unless he had been down here for years, returning to these walls again and again, documenting something only he understood. Or something he was forced to witness. The deeper they moved into the room, the stranger the evidence became. They noticed food items from different time periods, rusted cans from the 1980s beside plastic packaging from the 2000s. A broken lantern sat next to a more modern LED flashlight. Someone had continued living here long after the shutdown. Someone who adapted, scavenged, survived. But as they ventured farther inside, they found objects that suggested more than one person had occupied the chamber. 3 bedrolls lay in different corners, each with distinct wear patterns. Clothing of varying sizes hung from nails. Old shoes, men's, women's, even a child's pair, lay scattered. The implication was chilling. Multiple people had been brought here. Or trapped here. Mara moved her light along the far wall and noticed a section where the writing changed entirely. These messages were not frantic. They were meticulously written in neat, deliberate handwriting, the same style as the annotations found in the torn log pages. He wants them back. They never leave completely. I write so they remember. Keep the rooms full. Then one message was circled over and over, she follows him. Who was she? Who was he? The messages read like fragments of someone's unraveling mind, or the testimony of a person who knew more than they could ever reveal. As Mara read, an officer called her over to a cluster of personal belongings piled beneath an old ventilation grate. Among the objects were 2 wallets containing IDs of long-missing guests, their photos faded. A child's notebook filled with doodles of the resort's architecture. A staff keycard belonging to an employee who had disappeared the same year the resort shut down. Each item placed with unsettling care, as though someone had been preserving fragments of the people who vanished. A forensic analyst pointed out something horrific: many items showed dust layers inconsistent with the chamber itself. Some were old. But others had dust barely weeks thick. Whatever, or whoever, transported these items into the room had been there recently. Then came the discovery that rattled Mara more than anything else so far. Fingerprints. Not just on one object, but everywhere, on the walls, the log pages, the cans, even the bedding. They collected dozens of samples. When analyzed, they revealed something impossible: multiple fingerprints matched Jonathan Hale. But the aging analysis suggested a horrifying conclusion: these prints had been left at different eras. Some were decades old. Some were no more than a year old. The idea that a man missing for decades had walked these halls recently was unthinkable. But the evidence contradicted every natural explanation. Unless Jonathan Hale had never actually left the resort. Unless every search had overlooked the one place no one imagined someone could survive. And unless he wasn't alone. A sudden radio crackle snapped everyone to attention. The officer stationed at the entrance whispered urgently, "Detective, you need to see this." Mara followed him back through the narrow passage. Her light skimmed the dusty floor, and she froze. Fresh footprints. Bare footprints. Leading away from the chamber. The prints were small, adult-sized, but narrow, delicate, possibly a woman's. They hadn't been there when the team entered. They led down the hall, following the same direction the hidden messages had warned about. At the very end of the corridor, pressed into the dust as though left moments earlier, was a single phrase traced by a fingertip: "Don't open the last door." Mara's pulse quickened. Because the tunnel continued. And at the far end, barely visible in the dark, stood one more sealed door, bigger, stronger, reinforced far beyond the others. Something waited there. Something the resort had spent decades hiding. Long before investigators reached the final sealed door, theories began spreading like wildfire through the department. The resort was no longer viewed as just the site of strange disappearances. It had become the epicenter of something far bigger, darker, and more carefully orchestrated than anyone had imagined. Every discovery from the hidden chambers only intensified speculation. And as Mara and her team pieced together scraps of forgotten evidence, a frightening pattern emerged, one that stretched far beyond the resort's walls. It began with the floor plans. Architectural records from the resort's construction phase didn't match the structure Mara had explored. Entire hallways, staircases, and rooms existed in the real building but were absent from official blueprints. Engineers confirmed that these were not later modifications, they were part of the resort's original framework. Someone had intentionally erased large sections of the design before submitting them to city inspectors. The implication was chilling: the resort had always been built with hidden spaces, places never meant for guests or staff. Only a select few would have known about the secret corridors and chambers. One engineer whispered the thought no one wanted to say aloud: you don't build something like this unless you're hiding something, or someone. Rumors of a secret society had circulated among locals decades earlier, dismissed as folklore. They spoke of gatherings held in the woods before the resort was even built. Symbols carved into trees. Campfires that burned long after midnight. A group known only as the Founders, said to include wealthy businessmen, landowners, and high-ranking officials. Most believed these stories were exaggerations, until Detective Mara found the symbol. It was scratched into the concrete behind the second welded door. A circle with 4 intersecting lines, like a compass with no true north. It matched the crude drawings discovered among Jonathan Hale's papers, repeated over and over until the lines dug deep into the page. And more disturbingly, it appeared on several of the torn log pages, drawn faintly beside the names of missing individuals. Jonathan hadn't just known the symbol. He had feared it. As Mara investigated deeper, old police reports revealed another pattern: nearly every missing person at the resort had some connection, however minor, to the original investors. A distant relative. A business competitor. A whistleblower. Someone who threatened financial exposure. Even Laura Bennett's father had once worked for a company involved in a lawsuit against Hale's primary investor group. These connections were small, scattered, and seemingly insignificant alone. But together, they formed a web. One Mara couldn't ignore. Then came the interviews. Former employees, now much older, some living far from the region, slowly began sharing pieces of information they had kept buried for years. One housekeeper recalled seeing groups of well-dressed men arriving late at night, escorted through private entrances, never using the lobby. Another remembered overhearing staff gossip about strange meetings held in basements no one else had access to. A former security guard told Mara something even more disturbing: there were nights we were told not to patrol the West Wing. Said the guests wanted privacy. But there were no guests checked in. Not in that area. Not for years. He paused before adding quietly, and sometimes, we heard chanting. Mara wrote down every detail, though she struggled to separate truth from decades-old fear. Memories warp. Stories exaggerate. But too many accounts aligned too perfectly to dismiss. Whether or not a secret society had actually existed, something deliberate had taken place inside those hidden corridors, something organized, protected, and concealed with precision. But the most haunting testimony came from an elderly former receptionist, trembling as she described an event she had tried to forget. She recalled a night when a woman arrived at the resort, panicked and bruised, begging to speak with Jonathan Hale. The receptionist remembered her repeating the same phrase: "They found out. I can't go back down there." Before she could call for help, 2 men in suits escorted the woman away. The receptionist never saw her again. Her name did not appear in the guest log. Her presence was never officially recorded. And the next day, Jonathan Hale seemed unusually shaken, pacing the grounds, refusing to enter the West Wing at all. That testimony planted a terrifying thought in Mara's mind: were the missing guests victims of a crime ring hiding beneath the resort's luxury facade? Or were they participants, unwilling or otherwise, in rituals taking place in the sealed chambers below? Some investigators leaned toward a trafficking theory. Others suspected an underground psychological experiment. But a handful began whispering something far darker, something bordering on occult. The overlapping symbols. The repeated warnings etched into walls. The mention of she and he in the messages. These weren't random scribbles. They were repeated motifs. One criminal psychologist reviewing Jonathan Hale's notes pointed out that many phrases resembled obsessive mantras often found in cult environments. Words like, keep them inside, rooms shift, and, she follows him, suggested ritualistic belief systems rather than criminal operations. But Mara wasn't ready to commit to any theory. The only thing she knew for certain was that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide the truth. Then an anonymous letter arrived at the police department. No return address. No fingerprints. No DNA traceable. Inside was a single sentence written in the same frantic style found in the underground chambers: the guest book is incomplete. The real record is still inside. Mara's heart tightened as she read the second line, scrawled beneath the first in hurried strokes: they're not gone. They were never meant to leave. The message wasn't a threat. It was a warning. And it meant one thing: there was another chamber. Another set of records. Another part of the story still buried deep within the resort. Something that the sealed door at the end of the tunnel was protecting, or imprisoning. The atmosphere inside the resort changed the moment Mara stepped beyond the final stretch of hallway. Even the air felt wrong, thicker, colder, carrying a faint vibration that hummed beneath the silence. The reinforced door at the tunnel's end stood like a tombstone, untouched for decades, sealed so thoroughly it almost disappeared into the concrete. Every instinct in Mara's body told her to turn back. But it was too late for that now. The sound of the cutting torch echoed through the corridor, sparks dancing against walls covered in old warnings. Don't open the last door, one message had pleaded. Mara tried not to look at it. She tried not to think about the footprints, fresh footprints, leading toward this very place. Something had been standing here not long before. Watching the sealed door. Waiting for someone else to open it. The final weld cracked with a high metallic scream. Then, with agonizing slowness, the door shifted inward. A gust of freezing air swept past them, carrying the sharp scent of damp stone and something older, something that smelled like abandonment, fear, and memory gone rotten. Flashlights struggled to penetrate the darkness inside, scattering over rows of overturned chairs, a long table coated in dust, and papers fluttering faintly in the breeze from their movement. It was a conference room, but unlike any Mara had ever seen. This chamber didn't appear on any blueprint. It shouldn't exist. And yet it stretched wider than the dimensions of the resort would allow. The walls bowed inward, warped slightly, as though the room had been built under immense pressure. A projector hung crookedly from the ceiling, long dead. And at the far end of the table lay a leather-bound book. A second guest logbook. This one was older, its cover cracked and sinking, pages yellowed and swollen from moisture. Mara's pulse quickened as she approached. She flipped the cover open. Dust spiraled upward like smoke. Names filled the pages in tight columns, far more than the number of people ever known to stay at the resort. Many were written in a rushed, chaotic hand. Others were neat and careful. But every name had a corresponding room number, a date, and in the margins, strange symbols. The same symbols carved into the hidden chamber walls. The same ones found in Jonathan Hale's sketches. This wasn't a guest log. It was a catalogue. A record of disappearances. The date stretched back earlier than the resort's official opening year, names listed before construction even began. And the entries continued uninterrupted through the years the resort was operating, and beyond. Long after the shutdown. Long after the building had gone dark. "Detective," one officer whispered, his light trembling as it pointed toward the far pages. "You need to see this." Mara flipped to the final entries. Her breath caught. There, on the last page, were the names of every missing person tied to the resort: Laura Bennett, Michael Caldwell, the unidentified guests whose belongings had been found underground. All written in a single column. All bearing the same date. A date decades after their disappearances. It was impossible. It was madness. But the ink was fresh enough that it glistened faintly under the beam of her flashlight. Someone had written these names recently. Someone who knew exactly who was missing. Someone who wanted them remembered. Or claimed ownership of them. She turned one more page. Her hand froze. The next sheet held a single name, written in large sweeping letters that carved deep into the paper, Jonathan Hale. Below it, in smaller handwriting, almost delicate, he brought them in. She kept them here. Mara felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. Another set of footprints, different from the ones in the corridor, trailed around the table, circling it multiple times, as if someone had paced endlessly before writing that final line. The dust around the book had been disturbed. Someone had been here. Recently. Suddenly, a faint creaking echoed in the room. A chair moved, just an inch, but enough to make the entire team whip around, flashlights converging on the sound. The chair settled, still swaying slightly, the metal legs screeching across stone. Mara stepped back, her breathing shallow. The room felt alive now. Watching. Listening. Then her radio hissed with static, not noise, but a voice, faint, a whisper, "Leave." The word lingered in the cold air, vibrating with something that wasn't machinery. Her team didn't wait for a second warning. They backed toward the exit, flashlights shaking, boots crunching over papers documenting decades of vanishings. Mara was the last to leave, her gaze locked on the final page of the logbook as she shut the door behind her. For a moment, just before the metal sealed, she swore she saw movement in the darkness, shadows gathering around the table, drawn toward the open book like moths to flame. Once outside, Mara exhaled shakily. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The investigation wasn't closed. It wasn't solved. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty: no one disappeared from the resort. They were taken. And the resort had never truly shut down, not for the ones still inside.